She grew up there and also did her bachelor's in zoology and ethnic studies at Colorado State University. After completing both, I guess, during and after her bachelor's degree, she also got a variety of different professional experiences, pretty diverse ones, from one of her first tastes of field biology, working with our very own Viviana Ruiz Gutierrez down in Costa Rica on resident tropical birds, and also working at the Denver Zoo, so taking care of some of the animal collections there. She's worked for Forest Service, also for Colorado Parks and Wildlife on some pretty timely topics. So she's worked with greater sage grouse and also oil development, so things that are very much in the conservation dialogue these days. When Gem first contacted me about her interest in pursuing a graduate degree, I was, of course, instantly impressed because she had been awarded this Gates Millennium Scholarship that actually funds her entire college education. So that's really impressive. There aren't many of them out there in the country who've received such prestigious and competitive awards, so that's great. But I also was really struck by her interest and dedication to pursue a pretty difficult topic. She wanted to work in Latin America. She wasn't really sure where, and on some topic that combined both social and ecological dimensions. And she managed to do it. International work is really difficult to pull off, let alone just in a master's program, because the time is so constrained. But Gem has done that both on the research front, and she's also, what you'll hear toward the end of her talk today, also done quite a lot of outreach with the community that she's engaged with. So it'll be great to hear from her all about her work.
Well, I also have to do a quick shout out to Amanda because she had a big day today and is now a professor officially at Cornell. So it's also So thank you all so much for being here. It is just so exciting to see so many familiar faces and to be back here in Ithaca. Many of you in the audience are in my acknowledgement section, and you've really made this possible to be able to do such a neat master's project that was everything that I hoped that it would be. So I'll be telling you about my experiences working in Guatemala over the past 2.5 years, and working with the Department of Natural Resources, the Lab of Ornithology, and our NGO that we work with in country, which I'll show this logo as we go, really was the perfect combination of holding my interest in ethnic studies, conservation, and my newfound love for food systems and food sovereignty. So I'm excited to get started. So the general roadmap of our talk today will look at the dilemma of the 21st century. How do we feed the world and conserve biodiversity at the same time? Intro to Guatemala, 2 papers of my master's thesis that I hope to publish. Chapter 2 is more bird-focused on conservation in agroecosystems. The second one is more on sustainable livelihoods for people in agroecosystems. We'll look at how things tie together, and as Amanda said, I'll be excited to explain how some of our project research applications occurred through 2 enrichment projects in Guatemala. So I always like to start out with this photo. This is Cebo, a Quechua Mayan village and one of my field sites in Guatemala. One of the first things you might notice about this photo is it is quite fragmented. It is not a pristine environment. You have a traditional Quechua Mayan house sitting at the edge of a very, very steep, highly intensive broccoli field. And in a lot of cases, intensive farming is the only livelihood option that farmers have at higher elevations. And so we might consider ways that this may or may not work from a social and economic standpoint. And like Guatemala, there are many other tropical landscapes that look like this one. They're highly modified for human use, and they tend to be areas where high levels of poverty and biodiversity co-occur. In fact, malnutrition and biodiversity are found in many different regions of the world. This map is showing child stunting, and that's a form of malnutrition. And over here on the Western Hemisphere, we see that Central America, and particularly Guatemala, is at the center of this. It actually has the highest rate of malnutrition in all of the Western Hemisphere. And the continuing threats of deforestation and agricultural expansion due to monocultures is further threatening malnutrition and biodiversity conservation in the area. So the big question of the 21st century is, can we feed the world and save nature at the same time? It's been named one of the hardest things to try to figure out, and I thought it would be fun for a master's project. So I unfortunately cannot change the world in 2.5 years, but I really did try. And two of the paradigms that have been offered as to how do we deal with this problem. One of them is called land sparing, and this is the idea where you have intensive agricultural production in certain parts of land, and then separate from that are protected areas or natural areas. So you have sort of this either-or idea. With land sharing, you have less intensive agricultural production among forest and natural habitats. And this is generally kind of the picture that you see with Sebois, so agriculture and forest co-occur. To give a couple of examples, the Green Revolution was really one of the first projects that coined the term land sparing. And land sharing, you are maybe familiar with wildlife-friendly farming or things like agroecology. So we'll speak about those. Guatemala in particular really does have the capacity for looking at land sharing schemes. In fact, we know that diverse agroecosystems support humans and nature for a variety of different reasons. There are many ecosystem services that can be obtained from a landscape like this one. In Guatemala, we have these high elevation forests called cloud forests, and they're really critical to provide a clean water for the people below. Polycultures is something we're going to talk about for this presentation, and that's basically when you have very diverse array of crops that are farmed within an area versus a monoculture that you might think of, with sun coffee or something like that. And polycultures really promote resilience in agroecosystems because they allow the environment and people to buffer against any shocks that may occur due to the climate or shocks from the market, for example. And these landscapes also seem to be more conducive to food sovereignty. They allow retention of culturally significant heirloom crops, and they allow farmers to be less reliant upon externalities such as loans or agrochemicals. So let's get into my research questions. Given that tropical agroecosystems do support humans and humans and wildlife, I wanted to see, what are the more specific ways that that is possible? So how do they support migratory and resident bird conservation? Which agricultural practices best support sustainable livelihoods? And which agroecosystem characteristics promote both healthy human communities and biodiversity conservation? Turns out that Guatemala is one of the best places to study these types of questions. So just to orient where we are here, we're at the southern tip of Mexico in Guatemala, highlighted in dark gray. And I studied in the Central Highlands in the Department of Alta Verapaz. So now we're going to zoom into Alta Verapaz. I worked in two important bird areas, the Sacranation Yalihush mountain ranges. And these are named important bird areas because they harness some of the world's most diverse bird communities. There's over 300 species. And despite the fact that this area is over 50 to 75% agriculture and very few forests are protected, still a large amount of birds exist here that are conservation priority. And so we'll talk about some of those, but many of them are endemic species, migratory birds, or forest restricted. Just as impressive as the biodiversity is the cultural diversity in Guatemala, it really is a hidden gem in Latin America. It has over 23 different Mayan languages. We primarily work with Quechua Mayans. And a lot of these Mayan groups have retained a lot of the cultural customs, and one of those being the food systems that are there. So the crop diversity is just amazing, and the different types of knowledge that people have about these foods and their value could be a whole symposium in itself. In the Sacramento, Livelihoods important bird areas were actually named after sacred mountain ranges of the Kekchi Mayas. There's just a lot of incredible diversity in this area, which makes it such a good place to study these questions. And I wanted to highlight this photo here. Lydia and Sara were two of our environmental education teachers, and they're holding makoi, which is a cloud forest plant that they harvest from the understory. And a bit more information on the 3 village sites that we worked in. So we have Senutaka was our lowest elevation site and our most forested site, so you kind of have a gradient here. Senutaka was characterized by mega polycultures. This place was really impressive with the crop diversity. It also had a coffee cooperative and a cloud forest reserve. Chichen was our middle site and also the location of Community Cloud Forest Conservation, which is the NGO that we worked with. Here there was also a private cloud forest reserve and an adjacent village with a coffee finca, or a larger coffee farm that was less diverse with shade coffee, but it did have shade trees, and we'll speak about that. Sebald is the photo that I showed you at the beginning. This is our highest and most deforested site and characterized by intensive vegetable export, but they also have a lot of different things like fruit trees and wool. There just seem to be the least amount of livelihood opportunities in this remote area. All right, so let's get right into it. Chapter 2, Conservation Value of Tropical Agroecosystems to Resident and Migratory Birds. The 2 more specific questions that I was interested in were, what microhabitat and landscape level features best predict habitat use of our focal bird species? And how do forest resident, endemic, and migrant species differ in terms of their habitat use? So for the past 20 years, the literature has been quite rich, looking at how agroecosystems can support wildlife. Shade coffee is probably one of the most famous examples, and many studies have looked at how it supports diversity of ants, butterflies, mammals, and most famously birds. In fact, bird species richness of migratory birds has been found to be even greater in shade coffee than the adjacent forest. So a lot of these systems, if they promote varying levels of structural diversity, really can support migratory birds. Though the shade crops also benefit from the birds. A recent study looked at how migratory birds provide pest management services to farmers. Other types of agrochemicals such as silvopasture or agroforestry, including cacao, tea, agroforestry with tea, all types of different things have also been shown to be important to wildlife. Though, in the literature, a lot of studies have mainly focused on migratory birds during the wintering time, usually about November to March. And so we might be missing the other time periods of the year where forest residents exist without migrants. So that begs the question, what about these forest residents that are dependent upon forests during the times when they might be breeding? So we'll talk a bit more about that. And here's just a photo I wanted to show the landscape of Sebab. And we know that landscape context also matters for the conservation value of agroecosystems, especially for forest-dependent species. So given the previous literature, we hypothesized that occupancy, or habitat use, by focal species would increase with structural complexity of farms and amount of forest cover in the landscape. We also thought that resident species would be less likely to use highly modified habitats during the breeding season, and migrants would be more general in their habitat use. So the methods that we used in order to look at bird habitat relationships was a typical avian point count survey, which for those of us who are not ecologists is essentially where you stand at a point and in 50 meters you write down the number of different species that you see and hear in a certain time frame. So we did that across our 3 sites at 142 locations using either a 10-minute passive protocol or a 16-minute owl mobbing protocol, which helps us detect these species a bit better when they're not singing. And like I mentioned, we wanted to see the differences in breeding season and non-breeding season for our focal species. And all of my data is publicly available on eBird if you want to do a master's yourself. So, I don't know if Chris Wood is here, but eBird, I don't know if he could make it today. So at each of our point counts, we also collected vegetation information. And so of our points, we classified them into one of 6 agroecosystem types. We had corn monocultures, mine polycultures, semi-shaded coffee, pine plantations, secondary and primary forest. And in order to quantify each of those habitat types, we took several different measurements. So things like canopy cover, tree height, tree density, structural complexity of the agroecosystem. If you recall that one photo showing the different varying levels of agroforestry. We also looked at landscape level features such as percent forest cover within a larger area than 50 meters, so something more like 600-meter radius, looking at 100 hectares. We focused on 68 species, either because they were forest residents, neotropical migrants, or endemic species. And we did simple species richness calculations across habitat types, which we'll speak about. But we wanted to get more specific as to the habitat relationships with some of these birds. So we focused on 15 based on a criteria that they were detected 20 or more times and that their detection probability was about 0.2 or higher. And so we had neotropical migrants, forest residents, and endemics. So what is detection probability? Well, I'm going to explain right now what is occupancy modeling. So occupancy modeling is essentially a method that uses presence or absence data of a species in order to tell the proportion of sites that it uses or occupies. And so we get this thing called an occupancy probability. And here we have a photo of Sarah, one of my wonderful field assistants who worked with me in Guatemala, and she is looking very, very hard for the resplendent quetzal. And we know that we don't detect species perfectly in the field. So just because you don't actually see a bird doesn't mean that it wasn't actually standing right behind you. So that's why I'm really strict in the field. Not really. So we have, in my study, we did repeat surveys, as many occupancy, actually all occupancy projects do. So we have 5 visits per point count location, represented by J at site I. And so this gives us a detection history. So Sarah saw the quetzal on point 1 and 4, but she didn't on 2, 3, or 5, either because it actually wasn't there or it was standing on a branch behind her and she didn't turn around. I know she didn't do that, but she did see a quetzal during my field season. So this gives us a detection probability, and remember I said 0.2 was what we went with for birds so that they weren't too rare and we could make some inferences about their occupancy. And so with the detection probability, we're able to have less biased information about their occupancy, which is what we're interested in for bird habitat relationships. So for each of our 15 species, we use single species, single season occupancy models in a program called Unmarked. And we model detection and occupancy simultaneously. And I'm just going to briefly zip through some of the covariates that we used in each of the models. So detection probability can vary by time of day, whether we used a passive or owl protocol, or a canopy cover to see how detection might differ by habitat type. And that's represented by this equation here, where alpha is our regression coefficient. And occupancy modeling, these models were a bit more simple in that they only varied with 1 of 7 site-level covariates. And remember, those are the different vegetation measurements we took, either microhabitat or landscape, such as canopy cover, epiphyte abundance in trees, tree density, understory, and then of course percent forest and distance to forest in the landscape. For each species, we came up with a candidate model set based on this criteria. And in order to rank the different models for each species, we used AKIC's information criteria, and we came up with a top model subset for each species. And we considered covariates to be useful for inference in occupancy if their beta coefficients did not overlap 0 within 95% confidence intervals. So to set the stage for occupancy, we're going to go over a quick look at species richness by habitat type. So on the y-axis, we have number of species, x-axis, we have our 6 habitat types, and then the letters A, B, and C denote if there is no significant difference statistically in species richness. So the first thing I notice here is how polycultures are just as diverse as pine and secondary forests, likely because they had a lot of structural complexity. Whereas coffee and monocultures were more simple habitats, and they were also positioned a bit further from cloud forest, so that might be why we expect lower species richness there. And of course, primary cloud forest was the most species rich because of how many forest species were in our focal list. All right, so now we're going to talk about the significant covariates within agroecosystems that were related to our focal species. So I'm about to show you some pictures of birds, and if you see a photo of a bird, that means that that variable was a significant relationship with regards to occupancy or habitat use. So starting with Neotropical migrants, we see that canopy cover is a great predictor for looking at habitat use in this guild. Tree density was also important, and landscape was perhaps less significant for migrant species. And with shade, coffee, certification schemes, it's no surprise that canopy cover was great for looking at habitat use in species. And so that may be one reason why those certification schemes are as so. Endemics showed a bit different pattern here. So on top we have non-breeding, and below we have breeding season. And the main thing I want you to get from this slide is that endemic species seemed to remain consistent with what types of features they were using in the agroecosystem. So over here, my favorite species in Guatemala, the green-throated mountain gem, used canopy cover in both seasons. And our blue and white mockingbird and rufous-colored robin remained associated with the landscape. Now, bushy crested jay is actually an endemic that's human-associated, and because it's found everywhere, we couldn't actually make any relationships with habitat use for this guy. Now, forest residents, it's a bit more complex. We see canopy cover as being useful for inference with habitat use, as we do with percent cloud forest, but this diagram is showing that these species tend to change which features they are using in agroecosystems from breeding to non-breeding season. And so if we're only studying species during this time frame, we might be missing out on other features that they're using in agroecosystems when they're breeding. So let's get some more specific examples here, and we're going to go with canopy cover here. So on the left-hand side, on the y-axis, we have occupancy probability, and remember that's 0 to 1, 1 being that a bird is very likely to use that area, 0 being unlikely. So our forest residents, to no surprise, use trees. They are positively associated with canopy cover, but perhaps at different magnitudes. And neotropical migrants had both positive and negative relationships to canopy. The black and white warbler, while it was positive, seemed to use a lower percentage of canopy cover compared to forest residents. And the common yellow throat actually would rather be in open areas. We're going to do the same thing for percent cloud forest in the landscape. Again, our forest residents, they just love forest. And so perhaps again at different magnitudes. Unique to our system are the endemic species, which happen to be human associated, at least some of them are. And the blue and white mockingbird and rufous-colored robin were more likely to be in areas away from forest. All right, so probably one of the most exciting findings of this paper was that forest birds may become more specialized when breeding. So let's talk about this some more. We have occupancy probability again on the Y and canopy cover here. Non-breeding to breeding season, we see a shift in their habitat use with canopy cover, where in the breeding season, they're using areas with a higher amount of canopy cover. So what does that really mean? Well, it really means that they're shifting towards cloud forest because no other agroecosystem has such a high amount of canopy cover. You know, some areas of secondary forest do. But because we're seeing this shift, then it may caution that they're actually going away from agroecosystems. Now we we see a more subtle but a similar pattern for the scaly-throated foliage glader, which is a forest interior species. From non-breeding to breeding season, it goes from restricted to even more restricted to forest, where they're unlikely to be found greater than 50 meters from the forest, which is about me to the back of the room, which is really, really interesting to me. So again, if we're only looking at species during this non-breeding time when they may be more generalist in their habitat use or even in mixed species flocks with migrants, then we could be missing some important pieces of their life cycle. All right, so some conclusions. The habitat and landscape attributes that were most important to focal species reflected structural diversity and forest cover in the landscape. Our cautionary suggestion here is that forest residents may become more specialized during the breeding season and perhaps less able to utilize agroecosystems. From a management perspective, the conservation value of agroecosystems may increase by retaining certain amounts of canopy cover in the landscape, so at least 20% on farms and 60% in forest habitats. And then for forest residents, retaining at least 25 to 40% of forest in the landscape is really important. Though I didn't mention this in the talk, tree density and epiphyte abundance were also two important features to some of our species. All right, so switching gears now to Chapter 3, Sustainable Livelihoods and Biodiversity Conservation in Guatemalan Agroecosystems. So the main questions I was interested in this chapter were, what agricultural practices best support sustainable rural livelihoods? And which agroecosystem characteristics promote healthy human communities and biodiversity conservation? So if we go back to this slide about diverse agroecosystems, we just discussed how certain features of these agroecosystems are great for birds, retaining structural and floristic diversity and forest cover. But what features within these landscapes are beneficial to people? Perhaps things like certain types of crops or agrochemical practices. So things like that. And that's what we're going to talk about in this talk. So one way to quantify the different types of ways agroecosystems can help people is through a framework called Sustainable Rural Livelihoods. Now this was developed by Schoons in 1998 and more previously by Chambers and Conway, and essentially to look at what sustainable livelihoods mean. Essentially a household capital is comprised of many different types of assets, so social, natural, physical, human capital. And the idea is if you diversify these capitals enough, then the household will be more likely to be able to come back from shocks, either in the market or climate or things like disease and perhaps the coffee crop. And doing all of this while not undermining the natural resource base. Now, the Sustainable Livelihoods Framework has been useful for development interventions to be more targeted at certain capitals, but it has varying levels of support. And so Amikawa and Miguel Altieri have really argued that sustainable livelihoods may be lacking in that it focuses too heavily on off-farm livelihood options. So they really see sustainable livelihoods under the umbrella of agroecology. So agroecology is defined in a lot of different ways. It's both a science, a practice, and a paradigm for sustainable development. And for our cases, it promotes agroecosystems that are both productive and economically viable. And one difference from sustainable livelihoods, I would argue, is that it even more heavily focuses on culturally sensitive and socially just agroecosystems, which are principles of food sovereignty. And again, we do this while conserving the natural resource base. So that's kind of the framework that inspired me to think about agroecosystems. And crop diversity is one of the features of a diverse agroecosystem that we think might support sustainable livelihoods. So crop diversity is defined as the number of crops a household uses, whether that's a cultivated crop or something harvested from the wild, as well as livestock. And we might think that crop diversity would diversify human capital, one feature of human capital being nutrition, because perhaps if someone had more crop diversity, they would eat more different types of crops. And so this seems kind of obvious to us, right? Now, increased crop diversity might also diversify financial capital or income streams, because there would be more different types of products that could be sold to markets. Though surprisingly, very few empirical studies have looked at how crop diversity promotes nutrition. One of the first studies actually came out right here at Cornell, looking at some African agroecosystems. So it's really exciting to be a part of that. Financial capital, on the other hand, is well known to be something that can be diversified in agroecosystems. Though, like I said, many of the frameworks have emphasized perhaps too heavily on off-farm livelihoods. But maybe there are some ways on the farm that people can diversify their incomes. So our hypotheses, which I already mentioned, was that dietary diversity as a function of nutrition would rise with higher crop diversity. And that the number of crops sold to markets would increase with crop diversity as well. So our field methods included a household survey with Elvita here. She's both a friend and employee of Community Cloud Forest Conservation. And our household questionnaire comprised of about 12 questions, and generally we just asked farmers what crops they had, which ones did they eat or sell, how much are the crops sold for, and about how much do you sell, like as quantity-wise. And then also what types of agrochemicals are used. And we did homestays in the 3 villages and reached 42 households. The only analysis I really want to mention here is how we calculate household dietary diversity score and what that is. So household dietary diversity score is a measure of the number of different food groups a household consumes in a given time period. And it's a really good indicator of food insecurity at the household level, as well as nutritional status of women and children, as well as socioeconomic class. So this is a really easy way to look at food security across households. Now, these are the different food groups that we looked at. And then the calculation is simply just adding up the number of different food groups that people consume over a growing season, which was the time period that we chose. Now, I've highlighted vitamin A here because vitamin A is one of the biggest micronutrient deficiencies in the region. We wanted to see which households might be more micronutrient poor with regards to vitamin A. Another way we wanted to do this was by creating a vitamin A weighted dietary diversity score. And all this is doing is just adding more weight to vitamin A by giving a point for each individual vitamin A rich crop that was consumed. All right, so we'll get into some of the descriptive results with regards to crop diversity now. So we surveyed for 74 different crops. To me, that was amazing how diverse these agroecosystems are, and I'm sure there are many that we missed. So from the household level, Senim-Takaf, you remember that low elevation site really has these mega diverse polycultures, and their average household crop diversity was 32 different crops, whereas the other ones were closer to about 24. A couple of patterns that we noticed was 100% of households harvested a variety of different cloud forest leafy greens. They tend to be high in iron as well. And of course, fuel wood, as people here do not have access to cook stoves or anything like that. A couple of the most common crops, the famous Mayan Three Sisters, corn, beans, and squash, but also a couple of these heirloom vegetables, including papaya palm and some really neat fruit trees. All right, so going back to our hypothesis, does crop diversity relate to dietary diversity? Well, from our simple linear regressions, we found that yes, there is a significant relationship between dietary diversity and crop diversity, such that for every 5 crops that were added, an additional food group was consumed by the household. So previous studies have confirmed the same pattern, including Jones and Hertforth et al. two studies that were actually based with some scientists here at Cornell. So while it seems obvious to us that if you have more different types of crops that you would eat them and you'd have a more nutritious diet, sometimes these empirical relationships are not always made. So this is why it's important to do this type of research. Not to our surprise, we also found that greater crop diversity also meant that more types of crops were sold in the market. And so this is important because households that have a greater diversity of products that they can generate income from may be more resilient to shocks from market price fluctuations or food quality standards to things like climate or plagues. So what about patterns within the specific types of crops? So to walk you through this slide here, on the y-axis we have income by workday. So what that means is essentially income that has been equivalated by 50 quetzales, so about $7 a day is a good day for income in Guatemala. And then on the bottom here we have some of the most common crops that were grown. So a pattern to highlight here is that the export crops were the most lucrative from our survey, compared to the heirloom crops and fruit trees, which were not as lucrative, so generating 10 or so work days per crop per season. Though collectively they might, when added up, be just as profitable as coffee or green beans. Now, one note is, while these values seem to be really high, they might actually be lower in reality because of how expensive the agrochemical costs are and the loans that farmers need to take out to grow these particular crops. And on that note, we found that the same crops that were profitable, these export crops, were also the ones that use the highest amount of agrochemicals. So the y-axis here is just the proportion of households that used each type of agrochemical, whether one of 4 different types, and then some of the common crops here. So again, these crops are using quite a bit of agrochemicals, and then the heirloom crops and fruits generally have low to medium use of agrochemicals. So here's a trade-off, really looking at the differences between what is making money and what is requiring chemicals, but then is that beneficial from an ecological and a social standpoint? So that I was really interested in some of those patterns, especially with regards to broccoli, which again I could do a talk about just broccoli. So on that note, so certain crops may better support social and ecological outcomes. And so we thought that heirloom and fruit crops, such as these cloud forest plants, raktish, makoy, chonte, and then other types of heirloom veggies and fruits, would perhaps be more beneficial socially and ecologically because they were both low input and they had high value from a nutritional standpoint, and they were more indicative of food sovereignty because they were culturally significant. As well though, cash crops do provide income for farmers, so maybe there's a way to integrate export crops that doesn't provide too much of a large trade-off with regards to these heirloom crops. So some of our conclusions here, diverse agroecosystems that retain cloud forests seem to promote high crop diversity through more diverse diets and income streams. Heirloom varieties, as we mentioned, may be better positioned to meet conservation and sustainable development targets than more intensive practices. I forgot to mention that agrochemicals are harmful to the environment, but I'm not sure if I need to say that. And agroecologically motivated development strategies that integrate export crops with these traditional food systems may be better suited for this area, especially because there is such a high amount of crop diversity in the region. All right, so I'm going to take a drink of water. So to bring this all back together from the bird and the human perspective in these tropical agroecosystems, I'd like to start out with this photo. This is a beautiful mural of a Chiapas agroecosystem. These are Mayan agroecosystems. From this photo, you can see the crop diversity is quite impressive here. everything from fruit trees to vegetables, agroforestry practices. So we're retaining in this agroecosystem both structurally and floristically diverse types of food systems that are often more indicative of food sovereignty. And also, we see in the background integrated forest habitat, which we know to be important to our forest-dependent species. So the point I want to make here is that Mayan agroecosystems are already biocultural hotspots within themselves. They are so diverse, and so perhaps a land sharing scheme would be more appropriate in this case. From our research, we showed that agroecosystems can support bird conservation. So we have this idea of biodiversity-friendly agroecosystems, but maybe they're also human-friendly, because we showed that diverse agroecosystems promoted more nutritious diets and diversified income streams for farmers, which might be better for their sustainable livelihood overall. And lastly, applying this research moving forward, we really think that a sustainable future to the Guatemalan highlands requires projects that are able to balance the different needs between human and wildlife communities. And one of the best ways to do this is to actually work directly with communities and find out what their needs are and what things seem to be viable. So that's what we're going to talk about next, is the different ways that we were able to use our research and apply it on the ground in ways that seemed both culturally appropriate and feasible in the area. So our first application project was called Planting Seeds for Conservation. And what we did here was a partnership between Community Cloud Forest Conservation, the Lab of Ornithology, and funding coming from the Disney Worldwide Conservation Fund. We had a 4-day environmental education camp where kids from over 18 different villages would come to the center to learn about bird conservation and ecosystem services of cloud forests. And one of the neatest parts of this was they also learned agroecological techniques. They learned how to grow and how to identify and cook some heirloom crops that are often absent within their diets, even though they used to be there, say, 50 years ago. So we're reintroducing heirloom crops into their diets and into the landscapes. And I'll talk about how we do that. We reached over 500 school children, 70 parents, and 30 young Kekchi women who actually were the teachers of the program in their own language, Kekchi Maya. And a special shout out to Lily Briggs and Jennifer Fee from the Cornell Lab of Ornithology, who developed this environmental education program at the Lab of Ornithology. So it's really neat that we were able to collaborate with them on that. Now at the end of this environmental education camp, students went home with fruit trees and heirloom crops. And they went home with their teachers to these very, very remote villages. They worked with parents to plant these trees, to show them how to cultivate them and to graft fruit trees to make more of them. It was really neat. And we reintroduced about 40 heirloom and some fruit varieties which were new for folks. And over 1,000 fruit trees were planted across these high elevation villages that are adjacent to cloud forests. And we really felt this was the best way to both improve diets and diversify the agricultural matrix for birds. Our second enrichment project was called Organizing for Communities and Conservation. Now, after we did the 2 field seasons and the environmental education program, we wanted to go back one more time to work with communities regarding the different research outcomes. So we organized a participatory conservation workshop. We drew over 75 different people from 18 stakeholder groups. We had everything from everyone from a subsistence farmer to a top scientist in Guatemala City. And it was really an amazing experience. Overall, the environment was very celebratory in nature, and people were really excited to be able to work amongst each other and find that other people were so interested in natural resource conservation. So I presented, like I am today, about my research findings, but instead of a presentation, we used different breakout discussion groups, and we talked about the different threats to the region, as well as idea mapping activities. So this is my favorite photo of our workshop where the groups had to design their own agroecosystem for conservation and communities. And it was quite interesting because a lot of the features that we found in our research to be important for birds and people, they already know this stuff. And so they were drawing it up within this idea mapping activity. And it was just so neat to see that our research was both feasible and well received by the local people who are actually the ones that are affected by these types of threats. So with that said, there were so many people involved in this project that made it possible. And I could go on and on about this, but I do want to highlight a few people. Most importantly, my advisor, Amanda Rodewald, really has been supportive with me for the past 2.5 years on a perhaps risky project. And Eduardo gave me the first idea to work in Guatemala in the first place, as well as Miguel Gomez, who provided me some cool ways to get involved in social science that I hadn't done before. The people within the lab of ornithology were critical to my success, including Viviana and Wes, who are out there in the audience, who were my honorary committee members throughout, and Nikki and Rick Felt, who were my parents in both Guatemala and Ithaca. The Department of Natural Resources was an amazing place for me to explore my interdisciplinary ideas. Jim and Pat were very helpful early on with some of these ideas. Many funding sources made this project possible. I most importantly want to highlight the Gates Millennium Scholarship. Bill and Melinda Gates are the reason I am here today doing a master's as a first-generation student. So that's very, very cool that I got to meet him, actually, and say thank you. The Atkinson Center and the Sustainable Biodiversity Fund really harnessed these interdisciplinary ideas, and that led us to the Disney Worldwide Conservation Fund eventually. Of course, my wonderful field assistants who I worked with in Guatemala, including, I think Sarah is the only one here today, but she was great, as were all of the other students. Friends and family and the graduate student organizations, including the Latino Graduate Student Coalition and the Office of Inclusion and Student Engagement. I think, shout out to Sarah in the back there, and all the Cornell Gates scholars. And most of all, the people I worked with in Guatemala remained my inspiration throughout this project, including Robin Tara Cahill over at Community Cloud Forest Conservation, Lily Briggs and Ian Pope, who were my counter graduate students who were also working in the area, and all of the communities, the children, the young teachers who we worked with, really just inspired me on a day-to-day basis. So thank you all for coming today, and that will be it.
Season when you were looking at birds, and I was just wondering if you also considered season when you were doing the food security or food insecurity analysis.
That is so interesting. So she asked, did I look at seasonality with food systems as well? So I only surveyed during the July and August months, and it would be really interesting to add another time period to look at people's diversity. I didn't do that, but I think we may have covered, I think what you're getting at here is because we asked people what crops do you have throughout the year. So even though we surveyed in July, they don't grow broccoli in July, but they knew what we were getting at. Like, let us know what your full catalog is of crops. But that's a very important thing, especially in these areas where there's droughts and kind of dry periods where people are really not eating very much. So good call on that. Sure, Steve.
Hey, Jim. Good job. Thanks. You started off talking about birth weight. Is that true?
Yeah.
Okay.
Or I think stunting rate.
Yeah, stunting. Yes. Did you get any correlation between diet and breadth of diet in these communities and better or different?
I did not directly look at that, but nutritional status is directly related to the chance of a child stunting or not.
Yeah.
And so that's just one metric of malnutrition. And
did you see a difference? Like
You
down in
know,
the low elevation where they have a broader.
I think that
Kind of breath.
unfortunately malnutrition is just rampant everywhere.
Right.
And so in studying Takha, I noticed that, people just had more opportunities. They had more different types of crops that they could grow, but, I couldn't, everybody was really short. So it's like, I don't, but that's something that you can look into, like, but anecdotally.
You were tall. Look, you're a giant.
I was really
You're
tall.
tall.
Yeah, that's probably why you asked that. But, any other questions? Yeah, Pat.
Thanks for the talk. I can remember when I had a plot in a community garden and people were upset with my diverse agroecosystem.
All the weeds
Yeah,
and all?
So I was curious, you were talking about if there was like a bigger canopy over, let's say, the monoculture that would improve the bird, but did you look at the economic trade-off there in terms of, is there any loss or anything like that associated with doing something like that?
So I did not directly look at the difference in value, like say, does someone make more money if they're in a sun plantation versus a shaded plantation? What I was really looking at is what was the diversity of income streams that people had, and they seemed to be more diverse when they had more crops. But to answer your question, there are so many studies that both support and refute that idea that polycultures are very productive and create more income, and there are other people from more agronomic backgrounds who say, intensive agriculture is really the best way to make more income. So I'm not sure if I...
Did you have the opportunity?
I didn't. That in itself is a really large, endeavor, because you have to consider things like costs of agrochemicals and labor input and off-farm incomes, and so that's something that is people do, but it wasn't something I had the chance to. But yeah, did I answer your question? Okay. Cool. Hi, David.
Hi, great seminar. Maybe you just answered the question, I missed the first part, but you showed an association of gross revenues with use of agrochemicals, but, and not surprisingly, there's an association in terms of net income use of agrochemicals. That would be a better measure of livelihoods. So I didn't know if you had that.
And
available.
so we wanted to look at that, but because we didn't have the costs of agrochemicals and looking at the different loads that people need to take out, we didn't have the net income that people made. So what I showed with that black bar chart was their total income that they make without subtracting the cost of agrochemicals. So, but yeah, that I think what David is saying is that would have been a better measure to look at the net income that is generated by the crops by the time you look at the